we've been in the book of Ruth. I've been talking to you about everyone needing a redeemer. And this morning we climax to close the book of Ruth in that fashion. It's God's great love story to all of the world. And we see it in the book of Ruth, but it's displayed most perfectly in the birth of Christ. We get to see in the book of Ruth how God uses a widow, a bachelor, and a foreigner to bring himself to his creation. The book of Ruth, it takes place within the time of the book of Judges. The book of Judges has a commentary at the very end. And it says about that time that everyone did as they saw fit. We see in the book of Ruth that even in unrighteous times that God's people can do what's right in the sight of the Lord. This morning we're going to be looking at the genealogy, and it's especially encouraging that we get to see God at work in this time. We can just leave with that thought, knowing that God sustains his purposes, whether everyone does what they see fit in their own eyes or not, and take courage that we can live rightfully before him in the tough times of life. All the time we've been reading the book of Ruth, knowing that there's stresses of the holidays. There's stresses of where do I go for dinner? Who do I invite over? What about this odd relationship? And the book of Ruth gives us helps in that. We have the time of thankfulness and we have the time of gift giving, but it's only done well with love that's displayed through Hesed. And we see that in Ruth. Christmas time is here now, and the baby in the manger needs a genealogy. So we're in the book of Ruth. And many of you have enjoyed reading through the story. Not being able to wait till you got home, some of you in the car in the parking lot finishing the story, wanting to know what happened, what took place. So the last time we reviewed, Ruth chapter 1 was what? It was the chapter of mysterious blessing. Mysterious blessing. Naomi is the main character, or what the book revolves around is her. And her husband dies, and her sons dies, and so now she's husbandless, without a child to provide and continue the family line. In that time, it's a serious issue. What we saw was God's hand has been in her life throughout time. And so we saw that serving a sovereign God, even dealing the hand of calamity, is better than serving a finite God, dealing the hand of prosperity. Because the hand of calamity needs more time to ripen. We get to see that God's great love begins to shine as she realizes that Ruth is by her side, and Ruth becomes the very means of redemption. Because Naomi needs a redeemer. We stepped into chapter 2. We got to see the fields of refuge. Recognizing, like it says in Proverbs, that in our hearts humans plans their course, but the Lord establishes our steps. And we got to see God leading Ruth to Boaz's fields, and how Boaz would provide temporary aid and provision and protection for her. To see how Boaz actively became the hands and feet of God's refuge for these two ladies. Being reminded of what Dallas Willard says, that every contact with another human being should be one of goodwill and respect, with readiness towards acknowledgement, making room for, and assisting in suitable ways. It's expected from the Christian in this time of year. We ought to be giving it. But what Ruth really needed is a relationship if she was going to have long-term redemption. And we got to the end of chapter 2, and we still find Naomi was living where? At her mother-in-law's. Not with Boaz. And what's going on, Boaz? We get to Ruth chapter 3, and we get to see loyal love. We got to see evidences that there is this loyal love, this Hesed love between Boaz and Ruth. People of good character. people we can model after in righteousness, to be active in our righteousness, not passive, to remain sexually pure in a culture that says anything goes, and to take comfort in the periods of waiting, knowing that God acts on behalf of those who wait for him. Isaiah 64. Ruth, in chapter 3, basically proposes to Boaz, lays it right out in front of him. And Boaz replies, not how we'd expect, not with a yes or no, but that he would love to marry Ruth if the first man won't. Ugh. Why? Well, because that was the right thing to do. And so Ruth, again, we find her back at her mother-in-law's, and Boaz headed off to town. In it, we get to see that Hesed love. Hesed love is described this way. It motivates actions beyond duty to benefit others without considering personal benefits. We see that throughout relationships, especially with our God. It's a description of him. We stepped into chapter 4, wondering, what will this stranger say? Will he marry Ruth? What we saw was joyfully, eternally after, because the stranger danger was avoided, and Boaz got to redeem Naomi, buying back her family's land, taking her into his household, marrying Ruth, and having a son to redeem the family name. And the problem was solved. Happily ever after for them. The reason it's joyfully, eternally after for us is because we got to see God's thread throughout Naomi's life. In chapter 1, and in chapter 2, and in chapter 3, God brings Naomi back to the land. God provides Boaz's redemption, and then God provides a son. All the time, he gets to be the hero of the story. God does. And so as we look that Naomi's life is threaded with God's hand, we take courage that he is doing the same in ours. And that changes the way we interact with what happens to our lives, our circumstances. So as we conclude, at least this was my experience in school. We sometimes see this in children's messages at small-town churches. You think back to storytelling time in school. Okay? Even you adults, take your mind back to your childhood. Stories really pop when you're a child. They really grab you. So you're in the classroom and the teacher says it's time for story time. And so you know what the drill is, and so there's a corner of the schoolroom that's designated for story time, and there's a carpet there, and you need to go there, and so you get out of your seat, out of your desk, and you travel over with all your friends, and you try to sit down with those friends that you like, and you're sitting on the carpet, and the teacher's in the corner, and she's got the book, and she's going to read to you. And you're looking intently at her face to get her facial expressions, and you're listening with your eyes. Maybe hoping that there's some pictures, right? Pictures that you can get a glimpse that would confirm and begin to get your imagination going on the story. Many people, even adults, may have heard the book of Ruth that way, in a similar fashion when it was first circulated in pre-Reformation. And so we've been listening to the Bible story of Ruth, and you can tell that the story's been concluding. Your mind now is almost not listening anymore to the teacher telling the story. You're beginning to actually think back through the story, recounting all that has happened. And your mind's at great ease because you know everything worked out in the end. That there is this Obed. And so your heart is full of hope again, and you're inspired by the great story displayed. You're still sitting there. And in your bliss, your ears, they're still catching the words of the reader, but suddenly they begin to get your attention again as they come into your mind, and you begin to think about what's being said, and you hear Ruth 4:17. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And you hear that now. Now you're awakened again. You're listening to the teacher tell the story again. Your mind is saying, wait, did I hear what I thought I heard? Did I hear David? And the reader of the story just keeps going, and you're thinking, wait, hang on. And so you're looking at your neighbor trying to figure out, do they have the same puzzled look? Did she really say David? And the reader just goes on. This then is the line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David. You did hear it right. You did hear David. And now you're awakened out of your stupor thinking that the story was great before, but now the story needs so much more. You've been listening about how the Christmas baby's genealogy, the Messiah that you've been looking for, the Messiah that you're looking for returning, came into the world. You've been listening about Naomi's life story, but it climaxes in the redemption through a baby boy. And now, as New Testament saints, we see this story is about how God brought himself to his creation. Naomi's Old Testament story, the book of Ruth, is part of our story because this has been part of God's great love story in the works for you, because everyone needs a redeemer. And so this morning I have some redemption stories for you. The text is small, the picture is beautiful. Verse 17 said, the women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Naomi has a son. As the pictures were turning for you as we were reading through, that's what you're waiting to hear. That Naomi has a son. That catches you off guard. Because she didn't have a son. Ruth had a son. Why is it saying Naomi has a son? Yeah, Ruth, she gave birth to the baby boy, but you see that baby boy would continue the lineage of Naomi through Milan. That's why he is described as Naomi's son. And this child, though not born of Milan, would take on his name. And this here really, this is a beautiful picture of adoption. Beautiful picture. We get so stuck in our whatever, American prosperity and so clean bloodlines and all that. Let me tell you, the world is a mess. The world is a mess. Third world countries where people are shooting each other, they don't care about that kind of stuff. They just care that somebody loves me. Somebody's taking care of me. Naomi, she becomes part of really like a foster mother, spending a lot of time with Obed, and Obed receiving the full inheritance of the family assets. He gets it all. Even though Obed's father, legally, according to the paperwork, is Boaz. A beautiful picture of adoption. They named him Obed. It's kind of striking, the wording here. Obed means servant. And he would do that. Servants, they are a blessing to those who they serve. And Obed, he's going to serve many. He serves Boaz, and he serves Ruth, and he serves Naomi, and probably many more. So he's true to his name. The narrator records the naming event to let us know that the women who took interest in Naomi were present when Obed's name was officially declared. when that happened, traditionally, it was a male-dominated event, and the only female present would be the mother of the child. So there's this focus on they, referring to the community women, recalling the reader back to chapter 1 when the community women saw and said, "Is this Naomi?" Recalls us back to there. This group of people saw Naomi empty-handed, and now in chapter 4, this group of people, they see Ruth's hands with a child and Naomi there, and they're rejoicing, affirming Obed's name, just as we rejoice in Naomi's hands being made full by God's handiwork. Interesting phrase. They named him Obed. And it says that he was the father of Jesse, the father of David, meaning that Obed is King David's grandfather. As the listeners of the book of Ruth were satisfied at verse 16, but then you read verse 17, all of a sudden they would have seen how important this story is for you and me. You thought the story was over and you thought it was great, and then it got even better. Way better. You see, the redemption of Ruth ultimately leads us to the redemption offered to us. Sort of causing you wanting to rewatch the entire movie, reread the entire book again, to see it, a fresh perspective, knowing what it has provided us. What about this genealogy? Anybody excited about genealogies? Anybody excited about your own genealogy? Ancestry.com has like bazillions of people going to it. It's pretty interesting. You want it? You doing that? Genealogies. We read through genealogies, especially when the ones we read to really are Luke and Matthew. We got to keep a few things in mind. I like the way John MacArthur says it. He says this: the purpose of a family record was not necessarily to include every generation, but rather to establish incontestable succession by way of the notable ancestors. The truth is, we do the exact same thing today. All right, you draw out your family tree. What do? We sort of highlight the ones that we think make us look good, and the other ones, I don't know where they came from. We sort of do that. It's nothing new. And Matthew and Luke's gospel are written to a certain audience, and so they tailor their genealogical record to make a theological point. Both of them, I think, include these 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, who was Uriah's wife, to help those that are especially struggling with the virgin birth. To see that God had used women like Mary in the past, those that were under suspicion of illicit sexual relationships. To help them see, take the blinders off, this is possible. When you look at the genealogy in Matthew and Luke, what screams out is, this is God's work. He used people, absolutely. But if it was left to man, it would be chaos. I don't even know if we'd even get there. It would have been for God's hand in it. The theological point that each of them are making, depending on their audience, is this, that Matthew, he's writing to Jewish people, and so he presents the legal line through Joseph, the son of David. Okay, that's important because they know 2 Samuel, the Davidic covenant. He also then talks about being the seed of Father Abraham. That's a big deal, the Abrahamic promise, going back in Genesis 12. He wants to make the point to the Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah, and he has to do it by the legal line, going back to David and going back to Abraham. He has a target in mind, and so he displays it that way. Luke has a different target in mind. He has a different audience that he's teaching. Luke, he's writing to Greeks, and so he presents the actual line through Mary, connecting with Matthew back to David, But then he goes right past Abraham to end with Adam, the first man. The Greeks were all about becoming the perfect man. Drove them crazy. Luke helps them see that Jesus was the perfect man. Here was the first man, and now here is the perfect man. A Greek audience. And so he makes a theological point using genealogies. Just a few things I want to show you in this, again, to display God's glory and his handiwork in the redemption story, his love to us. And it applies directly to the book of Ruth here. When we look at Numbers 26, we can trace that both Elimelech and Boaz must have belonged to the clan of the Perizzites from Judah's son Perez. Perez's father was Judah, and his mother was Tamar. We see that in the book of Ruth. It's chapter 4, verse 12. Let me tell you about Tamar. Okay? Judah, he was supposed to have his son redeem Tamar. That's why this is a similar story. It's why it's brought up by the elders sitting there at the gate. But he doesn't do it. However, what happens is Judah ends up having 2 more sons by Tamar. Perez being one of those sons. You can read the story in Genesis 28. Let's just say it this way. If Perez had to draw out his family tree in elementary school, it would be very colorful. It would look rather messy. You see, it's not about whom you were born by. It's about if you're born again. By whom you were born by tells us how you began. If you're born again, tells us where you're going to end. That's much more important. Much more important. Throw the family tree out the window. It doesn't matter. Where are you going in your end? Boaz, his father was Salmon, and his mother was Rahab. Rahab was the prostitute who hid the Israelite spies. You read the story in Joshua 2. Was delivered when Jericho was destroyed in Joshua 6. Her name appears in Matthew's genealogy in chapter 1, verse 5. That's where we learn about Rahab. I think what we see with this, with Rahab, is it's not about what you've done. We describe Rahab as the prostitute. That's who she was. It's not who she became. She changed sides. See, it's not about what you've done in the past. It's about what you do with Jesus now. Some have said it this way, that what's going to matter is God's going to ask you, what did you do with my son? It's not going to matter what you did in your past. He's going to ask, what did you do with my son? What did you do with them? The news is full of stuff. Much of it does not pertain to anything that is in here. Why? Probably because 2 things. It's not new, and it's not depressing. This is good news. That's why it's not in our news very much. He's going to ask, what'd you do with my son? What are you doing this whole time? It's how he's redeeming us. What are we doing with him? Doesn't matter about your past. Obed's father was Boaz. His mother was Ruth. Ruth was what? A Moabite. It didn't mean anything to you. It meant a big deal back then. Moabites were foreigners to the Israelites, and they had a really bad history. You look at Numbers 25, you'll see it there. And so very likely there's a racial tension there. And you see, it's not about the blood you have in your veins. It's about trusting God and now in the blood of Jesus. Does it matter your race, your skin color, where you come from, your lineage? She was a Moabite. God wrote her in the Messiah's line. Can it get any clearer? Cannot. You see, it's not about the blood that's in your veins. It's about trusting in the blood of Jesus, because Jesus' blood purchased salvation for every nationality, for all peoples around the world, the ones you don't like. The Jews didn't like Moabites. And they're in the lineage of Jesus. Here's what I see in these displays that I've given to you when we look at Tamar, and we look at Rahab, and we look at Ruth, and we look at this lineage of Jesus, this genealogy. You see, when I read through the genealogy of Jesus, it reminds me that God can use anyone. And if he can use anyone, then he can use me and he can use you. It reminds me that no one has messed up so bad that God can't redeem them. And if he can redeem people that are really messed up in this life, then he can redeem me. And he can redeem you. That's what I see in the genealogy of Jesus. Why is that good news? Why don't you see it on your TVs 24/7? I don't know. That's not this sermon. This story is about the fact that everyone needs a redeemer. I've said it multiple times. You may not even know what a redeemer is. You may not even know what redemption is. Why do I need a redeemer? I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you now. I'm going to tell you why the Christmas story is so important. Very simply, here is what redemption is. Redemption is release from desperate circumstances connected with a ransom necessary to effect that release. I'm going to spell that out for you. Before I go to examples, we got to see it directly in the book of Ruth when Boaz bought from Naomi all of the property of Elimelech. Ruth 4, verse 9. That provided redemption. You see, he had to pay the ransom to gain the land, and it took Naomi out of her desperate circumstances. A father will pay a ransom to his child's kidnappers. Pay a ransom to take his child out of desperate circumstances. Two examples of redemption. But what are the desperate circumstances? Why does that matter? My circumstances don't seem like they're that bad. I have a warm house. I have food in my stomach. Everything is fine. Well, it's not. You see, it's not because Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned. And that has consequences. Romans 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is death. Well, what is sin? Well, 1 John 3:4 says that everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. Okay, I'll just obey the law. I'm sorry, you can't. Romans 3:20 says, therefore, no one will be declared righteous by God's sight by the works of the law. See, here was the intent the entire time, that rather through the law we become conscious of our sin. It's a vicious cycle. That's why we are in desperate circumstances. That's why your neighbor is in desperate circumstances. That's why your children are in desperate circumstances. There's consequences. Okay? And we have to ask ourselves, based on the definition, that if there's going to be a release from these desperate circumstances, which I just told you, it has to be connected to a ransom that is necessary to actually effect that release. What is that? What is the ransom necessary to effect our release from our sin? 1 John 1:7 says, the blood of Jesus, his Son, purifies us from all sin. Matthew 20:28, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, that is the only way. That is the only necessary effect that can release you from these desperate circumstances is the Son's blood. John 14:6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He is the only way. So you need a Redeemer because we're in desperate circumstances. And to get out of those desperate circumstances, there has to be a ransom. That ransom was the blood of Jesus that came on Christmas Day and was resurrected on Easter. So what transaction takes place? How does Boaz get those funds to purchase Naomi's land? How does the son get the funds to the kidnappers to get his children back? Romans 10:9 and 10 say this. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with the heart that you believe and are justified, and with your mouth that you profess that you have faith and are saved. See, redeemers, they are grace givers. Being redeemed is a gift. You can't do it yourself. That's why the situation is desperate. Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, that no one can boast. That's why the baby in the manger is the greatest gift that you can receive this Christmas. The greatest gift. The best gift. The most glorious gift. Need a Redeemer for desperate circumstances. The only ransom possible is Jesus' blood. It's a free gift that we receive. We put our trust in it. Here are two verses that really wrap it up. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Or Ephesians 1:7, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace. We all need a Redeemer. Everyone needs a Redeemer. The book of Ruth leads us right to the Redeemer. Christmas time takes us to the Redeemer. We have read multiple redemption stories, Naomi's story. You got to see redemption stories from these ladies that are included in the genealogy of Jesus. Do you have a redemption story? If you do, have you told your children and your grandchildren about your redemption story? You see, Ruth's redemption story became part of our redemption story, and maybe your redemption story could become part of someone else's redemption story. And so tell your story. Tell Jesus' story, because everyone, Moabites, whomever, everyone needs a Redeemer, and maybe someone will be drawn to your God, the God, just like Ruth was drawn to our God through Naomi when she would say, your God will be my God. And so we tell our story. Ruth, she had some critical times in life. Had she made a different decision, we'd take her to a different trail. Different decision here, different trail. Different decision here, different trail. Lots of turning points in her life. That's why the book of Ruth is so exciting. It's beautifully written. The most important turning point in the book of Ruth is chapter 1, verse 16, when she decides to seek refuge in the wings of God. That's the way Boaz described it in Ruth 2:12. If you haven't made that most critical turning point in your life yet, now is the time. You can seek refuge through the Redeemer that God provided. The only way, trusting in the Son of God, Jesus. And if you have made that most important turning point in your life, then now is the time to reflect upon the importance of the Christmas child. The essence of joy that Chris picked up as you come in, because it's beginning to happen. We're changing our mindset to the beautiful story of redemption in the Christmas child. Here's a few things I think it does for us in this season. It can bring an overwhelming anticipation for the Christmas child. Why? It's because we know how much we were in need of him. It's like children knowing there's a present for them to unwrap. The anticipation builds and builds and builds. That's a good, overwhelming anticipation to have in this season. It's excitement in knowing that the salvation that God offers is to all people through his Son. That is the good news. That's what makes things exciting during this time of year when we interact with people, that maybe God is drawing them to himself. And maybe he'd use you in it. And then, in the stillness of life, there is this wonderful peace, isn't there? Just wonderful peace. Knowing that you're redeemed. Christmas ham could get burnt. Maybe somebody else already got you that gift. The list goes on and on of how the devil and his demons would love to discourage us in this season. To lift our eyes heavenly and just bask in the joy of knowing the redemption you have through this time of season in the Christmas child. That joyful spirit, here's what it does. It does to us what it did to Naomi as she held Obed in her arms, her Redeemer in her arms. It causes a contagious smile that says, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied with God alone.